share with you this morning a message about finding God in unlikely places. And the scripture this morning is from the 3rd chapter of Exodus, and the first 8 verses. Hear God's word. Now Moses was tending the flock of Jethro, his father-in-law, the priest of Midian. And he led the flock to the back of the desert and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. And the angel of the Lord appeared to him in a flame of fire from the midst of a bush. So he looked, and behold, the bush was burning, but was not being consumed. Then Moses said, I will now turn aside and see this great sight, why the bush does not burn. So when the Lord saw that he turned aside to look, God called to him from the midst of the bush and said, Moses, Moses. And he said, here I am. And then he said, do not draw near this place. Take off your sandals off your feet, for the place you stand is holy ground. Now think about that for a minute. Here we have this guy in his 80s. They say at this time Moses was probably in his early to mid-80s. He's out there in the middle of the desert with a bunch of sheep around him. And he hears this voice. If anybody were looking on from the side, they'd say, well, what is he talking to that bush for? We might say, well, that sounds crazy. But I want you to stop and think for a minute. Because as you came in here this morning, people greeted you and said hello and so on. But what if you'd come into the church and nobody said anything, but all of a sudden you heard a voice that said, come in and sit down? Because the building in which you gathered to worship is on holy ground. Makes sense to me. It could happen. I mean, we're here, God's here, and this is his ground. So what's the difference? So far from being a scene from 4,000 years out of the past, this is something that could actually have happened at a time such as today. We like to think of God in the nice, lovely things of life, but sooner or later, each of us comes to a point, at least once, where if we're going to find God at all, we're going to have to find him in an unlikely place. We're going to have to find him in the wilderness, just as Moses did. And today we all need that kind of insight as we look at the world around us. What was there about the going on inside of Moses that made him open to realizing that he was on holy ground? At this particular point in the chronology of Scripture that we have before us, we don't really know a whole lot about Moses, so let's back up a little bit and think about what's happened in Moses' life and the life of the Hebrew people up to this time. When Moses was born, you remember, all the male children that were born in Egypt at that time were to be killed, either to be thrown in the river and drowned or fed to the crocodiles, because the Egyptians felt that the Hebrews were starting to outnumber them. And if they continued to outnumber them, then they might decide they wanted to be in charge and turn the Egyptians to slaves instead of the way the Egyptians had planned. And so Moses is out here in the desert because of a situation that had happened earlier in his life, which we'll talk to here in just a minute. He had been brought up as the son of Pharaoh's daughter, even though he realized, and Pharaoh's daughter realized, that he was really a Hebrew. He had a pretty soft life as he was brought up in a palace, and probably as he got older, a lot of the people looked at him and said, what in the world is this slave doing here in the palace with all these privileges that he has? And on the other side of the coin, with the Hebrews themselves, they might have resented Moses too, so we don't know. But Moses, I'm sure, as he got older, he grew up with a resistance to see what he saw in the way his Hebrew people were treated by the Egyptians. And this must have festered in him for a long time. Until finally one day, when he saw an Egyptian taskmaster beating a Hebrew slave, he got so incensed that he killed the man. And at the time, he didn't think anybody had seen it. But the next day, he found out that was not true. Somebody had seen it. And so he knew that he had to flee from the land of Egypt, and that's what drove him over into the Sinai. Met a girl, got married, and started a family. And here we find him after 40 years out there in the wilderness as he is tending his father-in-law's sheep. And God speaks to him out of this bush. After that long time, we don't really know what kind of relationship Moses had with his God or how close he was to his Hebrew faith. But the idea is that he did recognize that this voice was something that was supernatural. And he responded and said, "Here I am." Did no good for Moses to kill the Egyptian, but it did do one thing, and it made it clear that Moses was no longer just somebody who was maybe a playboy from the office or the castle. He had seen something that was dismally wrong and did something about it. And this was the beginning of Moses, the Moses that he was to be, the Moses that was called by God. His anger may have needed some harnessing, but it was critical to everything that followed. It was basic to all that followed. Is there any really necessary to point out an application to our world today as we look around us? We see immorality and violence, and we wonder, how can all these things take place? How does God allow them to take place? And we say it'd be hard to find God here in this world, but what I say to you this morning is, let's keep trying. We try to keep finding God anyway. And Moses, most of us can see the many evils in the world around us that ought to arouse our indignation. The Lord calls to us each day, calls to every one of us each day to take a stand for Him with what we know to be right. The least thing we can do is to get off our seats and get rid of this sense of apathy we have and exhibit toward the immorality that we see going on around us. We can wake up to the serious issues of the day and of right and wrong that are around us in our present day, in our communities, in our nation. The start for Moses right here led him to a second stage in his progression from where he had been living as an Egyptian to where he was living as a Hebrew. Moses in the wilderness confronted Moses, the man called by God. He had never before had such a searching look at himself, to take a good hard look at himself, or anybody to do that. As we end up sometimes in the wilderness of our lives, is to be a soul-searching experience. We have to realize sometimes that when we get to that point, we realize that there is a divine opportunity before us. That is a real soul-searching experience. And in fact, God was telling Moses, Moses, take a good hard look at yourself and what you are doing and what you are as far as in this day and age. Moses' first reaction was to back away. What was he to do anything about the situation God was talking about in Egypt? It had been 40 years since he'd been in Egypt. The Hebrews that he knew probably were not even there anymore. They had passed away. And the Egyptians were certainly not people that were open to the stories of Joseph and his family when they first came there. And remember, this period of time was all part of that 400 years that God told Abraham about when he showed him the promised land. And he said, before your descendants come and to claim this land, you're going to have to spend 400 years in captivity. And this is part of that. And that's why it was such a situation that when Moses was born, he wasn't supposed to stay alive. They were supposed to be killed as a male Hebrew child. It's true. At first, Moses did shrink back from God's call, as many of us do. But Moses ultimately obeyed God and came to be a dedicated servant of his. What happened was that Moses did take a good hard look at himself, and when he did that, he dedicated himself to the call that God had extended to him. He found his victory in the wilderness, and a lot of times that's where we find our victories as well. That's the gist of it. With God's help, Moses would be Moses that he was supposed to be. He was supposed to be a divine voice had said to him, Moses, the place you stand is on holy ground. God is saying that to us today, to somebody right here this morning. Might be dealing with circumstances or a situation that may be a domestic situation or circumstances. Might be a financial situation or circumstances. Maybe something job-related, I have no idea. But God does, and so does that person that he's talking to. It may be a trying situation, a dreadful set of circumstances. But if the situation is dreadful, then that means that there is a need that has to be met. Tragedy is simply need spelled with different letters. And that means true, that there's an opportunity to help, then that's also something that is available. Many great souls have found holy ground in unlikely places, but they're placed there where they are because that's where God has called them to serve, and that's what makes the grounds where they are holy ground. To get to the meat of the message this morning, we have to see that Moses is called to go to a deeper level in this experience with God. And we're called to follow him and examine it closely. In this struggle with right and wrong as it pertains to his people in Egypt, Moses came face to face with God. When men have been what may have been his idea of God, it is clear from the record that Moses had no intention or no idea that it was going to extend to the idea of the service that God ultimately called him to. God met him right here in the desert